So firstly, Imam Nur, thank you very much for your time today. And firstly, why did you decide to set up an LGBTIQ friendly mosque in Melbourne, and how successful has it been?
Thank you for having me, and it's good to connect with your audience. I think primarily what I was looking for before the mosque 4 years ago, in fact it will be 5 years this November, was two things. One was a safe house for young people that were stuck in environments that were causing them family traumas. Because for a young person to transition safely, they can't be stuck in that environment. So a safe house so that they could keep the contact with the family, but at the same time find their independence. And secondly was a drop-in center where we could have a facility to educate parents in how to reinterpret scriptures that are outdated in a more contemporary fashion. The idea of the mosque came later on, because as the numbers started increasing, it was people were asking questions. We would like to go to a mosque. I mean, we had a member, a lesbian girl who is Muslim, and her religion spirituality is important to her, but she went to a particular mosque, and at the women's section, even though she was wearing the scarf as part of the tradition, another female person in the congregation said, dress properly, otherwise leave. So people that were rejected from this type of institutions, I thought, okay, how can we have this type of facility? And I'm a bit cautious of calling it. I know the ABC 730 report called it mainly a mosque. It was a spiritual healing center. That's what I have,
What does the Quran say about homosexuality in the original translation?
Nothing.
Nothing?
Nothing. The term is non-existent.
Okay, so there's nothing like in the Bible where in the Old Testament they talk about man lying with man.
Well, that is, it's not as specific as in the Bible. There is one verse in the Quran that talks, it's the same. The commonalities are quite extraordinary when it comes to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. But the term homosexuality, the term is non-existent. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah, a lot has been used over the years in the mainly three Abrahamic religions to condemn LGBTIQ queer people of different backgrounds. And in the Muslim scriptures, I studied commentary of the Quran, and in the Muslim scriptures, what they sinned is two particular villages that were by the Dead Sea in Jordan, in that area. Where they used to wage wars on each other, tribal wars, and it was a strategy of war that they used to use, which was to rape men, women, children, which is even till today is used in my country of origin, Somalia. When a tribe would come wage war on another tribe, and Somalia is the only country in the whole of Africa that speaks one language, has one religion, one sect. There's not even Sunni Shia. But yet, when tribal wars happen, the men of a particular tribe will rape young boys and women, and so it was a war strategy that was condemned, not the actual sexuality of a person.
So you're really saying that the anti-LGBTIQ push in the Muslim world is solely based on the story of Sodom and Gomorrah?
Correct, and it is. There are clear scriptures that talk about, for example, verses that talk about interest being proscribed, not allowed to buy a house on interest. Very clear verses. There are scriptures that talk about alcohol. There are scriptures that talk about gambling. Yet we Muslims always find a way to justify it. So the first family home is justified. You can buy it since it's because you're looking after the family. Or if a person is into gambling or alcohol, they say, the boy or the girl is going through a phase and they will be fine. However, the violent reaction when it comes to LGBTIQ, queer individuals in the Muslim tradition, I think because homosexuality challenges the notion of this masculinity, this gender roles, and that's why any threat to that masculinity is looked at and responded to in a very violent way, even though there are no scriptures. Muhammad, and one of the questions you'll ask is, did Muhammad say anything about LGBT? He never said throw gay people. In fact, he ordered for people to look after the transgender community in his lifetime. But those texts have somehow been kept away, and there's been this one particular ideology in the Muslim world predominantly that has been, flooding even intellectual minds when it comes to Islamic institutions and universities.
Wahhabism,
correct.
Yeah, the Wahhabist tradition.
With the help of the money, oil money.
From Saudi Arabia. Yeah. So how can Islam and homosexuality, or being a person of an LGBTIQ background, be compatible?
I am here. You're interviewing me. I am Muslim. I am a gay man. I'm a father. I'm a lover. I'm a person of color. We cannot put this human identity in a binary code. And spirituality and sexuality are but two qualities that make a person who have several qualities. They're just two qualities of a person. But when we, in the Muslim tradition, like in any patriarchal societies, even in the Christian world it was like that, in the Jewish world, there is this binary, a man's role is this and a woman's role is this. You can't. It's a very simplistic way of putting something that is not to be confined in a small space, which is the human identity, the human spirit.
Are same-gender acts permitted in Islam? I think you've probably already answered that one.
What is condemned in Islam is this notion of not having, if you have a partner, for example, and interestingly there are verses that talk about same-sex couples in the Quran, same-sex couples
really?
That would go cheat on a partner. There are a couple, but so what is condemned is that lack of loyalty when it comes to relationships. Yes, there are verses that talk about ladani and latani, the two men that will go and deceive. One of them is in a relationship, similar to adultery in the heterosexual world, and it's condemned in the Quran. Yet that commentary is somehow saying, oh no, it means two heterosexual men that do that, but it is not true. It is not true.
I guess in the Christian tradition you've got the story of David and Jonathan, which some people
and there was a lesbian.
Ruth and
yes,
Naomi.
Yes.
Correct. Did the Prophet Muhammad himself say anything about same-gender relationships?
There was he protected, like I mentioned, the transgender community. There's a verse that talks about men or women, how they can uncover they can be comfortable in front of strangers, and it categorizes who are those strangers to them. The family members. So a woman can uncover herself if it's her father there, her brother, her partner, and at the end of that verse that says, وَالرِّجَالِ غَيْرِ أُولِي الْإِرْبَةِ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ. A woman can uncover herself in front of men that do not have any inclination towards women. However, in this type of commentaries that we have now flooding the world in the Muslim universities, it says men that are in the age of 70s, 80s that have lost. I said, listen, my father is in his 80s and he still wants to get married.
So really, there are scriptures in the Quran which do acknowledge same-sex attraction and men and women who are attracted to each other.
Correct.
Yeah. Are there any examples of same-sex partnerships in the Quran? I think you've mentioned
not
one.
In the Quran, not like in those the ones in the Bible we do not have. But what the examples I mentioned were the ones that do the infidelity, if they are in a relationship, and that is the one what is condemned. So it is general rule about being loyal to one's partner.
What is the predominant school of thought when it comes to homosexuality in the Islamic world? You mentioned Wahhabism. That's one of the widest, conservative strands of Islamic thought in the world today.
So So that has been a big problem for me. I went to some very, very rural villages in some of the Pacific Islands, and their books have even. These are villages you can't reach by. There's no roads. You have to climb a mountain, canoe, and their books are there. And an ideology that's being funded. And the West are also culprits in this. Saudi Arabia wouldn't have existed if it wasn't by the West's support in that region and the oil. But it is, and they have used the oil money to flood one particular ideology, which is very extreme, violent, patriarchal, tribal, and maniacal way of interpreting Islam. So that is, and hence when you see ISIS and things like that, it is the same mentality, which is not Islam, which is not what the original Islam of Muhammad was.
Groups such as the Islamic State and the regime in Iran and Chechnya persecute and execute people for being gay. Is this justified in Islamic law?
No. And it wasn't long ago that gay people were being thrown off the gap here in Sydney, and Surrey Hills Police and have the history here. 40 years ago. I think the Mardi Gras, they're celebrating that this year. It is not justified at all. In fact, there's a saying ascribed to Muhammad that says this Adami, al-Adami bunyanur Rabb, this human being is a structure that God created. And then it says Rabbi mal'oonun man hadama, by God cursed is the person who demolishes this structure. And I come back to when Iran, you're talking about a very conservative Ayatollah-led country. Saudi Arabia the same. Chechnya, interestingly, they have a lot of support from the Saudi regime. These people are people who are still perpetuating this school of thought, and it's not something that is allowed in Islam at all.
Why is there such a hatred and persecution of LGBTIQ people in these conservative Islamic regimes?
I think it's because we still have, I think the Christian world has gone through this wars of Inquisition when the church and the state were separating. I think now what is happening in that region is I think what we're going through is a bit similar to those wars, because the grip of religion in every aspect of one's life is very tight. But interestingly, unfortunately, the media doesn't mention this, but there are positive signs. There are spaces being carved out in the world. Groups are reaching out from places I never thought. When I started the group, I remember in November 2013, 1 year later, I got contacted by a person in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia, saying we have started this LGBT underground group. I got contacted by a group in Tehran, in Iran, transgender support group. So young people are very innovative and they're finding ways, and the online platform has been fascinating.
And you've been helping with the Rainbow Railroad organization.
Yes, we have heard about the Chechen LGBT. Interestingly, you hear about gay and bisexual men, but there is no mention of the lesbian women, and they exist there. And it's a way of safety. They would get married, but still gagged. So thankfully, we have our group. We haven't had much support when it comes to funding-wise. But even though we haven't got this financial stability or power, means, last Ramadan, the last fasting month, I remember people were saying, why don't you organize a fasting iftar get-together? So we did that, and it was in collaboration with a group called -18 in Melbourne, and they hosted us in their place. So I said, instead of just coming and eating and everyone going home, think of your brothers and sisters in Chechnya and let's put money together. And it was the first fundraising event that we have done, and we were involved in helping a lot of this gay men move from Moscow, and I know some of the people that run the safe houses in Moscow. But even those safe houses, they were saying they have old, worn out, because even though they have them, but the Russian government is still quite homophobic. So they allowed those centers, and these centers are by people who are, some of them academics, some of them workers, but out of their goodness they decided to facilitate this platform. But they lack even basic means, old mattresses and things like that. So we said, how can we celebrate the month of Ramadan, the fasting month, but also give back to these people? So we were part of the group, one of the groups that helped these young people move from Moscow to Toronto.
That's good. Why are we seeing a backlash in some places in the Islamic world, like Indonesia at the moment, where they're calling for the death penalty in Aceh, for example, for people who are gay?
Well, when one feels threatened, they will hold on to anything. And I think particularly in Indonesia and Malaysia, and they were on my gaze since I started the group in November 2013. There is a large number of LGBT young people that are crying out. I mean, there is the transgender run mosque, and say it's like a refuge for transgender Indonesians. And I know the BB that runs that place, initially the media said that it was closed down, but it wasn't closed down. They said, we will shut you down. The government threatened them. But they couldn't provide an alternative for these people that were sheltered in that venue. I think the backlash is they trying to scare people into going back underground, because there are a lot of voices that are speaking out, and now this year you will have the first Indonesian float that will be marching as part of the Mardi Gras. So there are young people, and just before I came from Melbourne on yesterday, I was visited by a scholar from the Islamic University in Kuala Lumpur who's doing LGBT advocacy in both Indonesia and Malaysia. And he said even within Majlis al-Ulama, the Council of Scholars, there are imams who are saying, okay, we really have to do something about this, and we want to support the LGBT youth particularly. So there is a shift even in ways of thinking, which is promising.
Good. For those LGBT people who have grown up in the Islamic tradition, what psychological effect does it have on their well-being and psychological health to be told this conservative viewpoint? What internal conflicts do they face?
The trauma is, as a friend of mine who's an academic said, that when a child is natural emotions, we even in different parts of the world, we haven't been taught emotional literacy. So I remember when I was growing up, men don't cry, you're told. So you're suppressing a natural human emotion. The trauma that causes, and that's on an emotional level, on a spiritual level, to me it's in the same wavelength, it's the same weight. This academic she says it's similar to being involved in a severe car accident, where you have to go into rehabilitation and take months to recover. So it is, and sometimes you recover fully, sometimes you don't recover fully, but that trauma always stays with you. It's irreversible, the damage that does. I have thankfully just found ways of managing it, but it's irreversible.
Is there any way of remedying this within the confines of the Islamic faith?
That's why we have started. When I started the group in November 2013, there was a vacuum in the support services, particularly of LGBTIQ queer Muslim youth, and generally queer youth. I mean, I started Marhaba for LGBT Muslim young people. Then we had Jewish members, because people have partners, and they would bring their partners, and people that have been traumatized by their Catholic background. My ex-boyfriend of 10 years was a Catholic man who hated anything to do with the church, and it took me a long time even to understand that. So I thought, okay, how can I facilitate a platform where we can provide healing for the damage that has been done with this religious hierarchy, and also reconcile the two, see if we can reconcile spirituality with sexuality, and not let go of one to have the other. And it has been thankfully effective thus far.
For an LGBTIQ person who is listening to this program struggling with their sexuality, who's grown up in the Islamic faith, what message would you have for them?
I say, hang in there. There's an alternative, and reach out, see where there is avenues, and reach out for help. Don't just suppress it, because trauma that is suppressed will always manifest itself later on in different ways. Hence the issue with young people who have a lot of mental health issues, and that's the trauma that is not addressed, especially when so there is hope, there is an alternative. Hang in there and just reach out.
In your opinion, why did God or Allah make LGBTIQ people?
Why did God make black people? Why did God make Asian people, white people? It is, and there's a verse that comes to mind now that you asked that, Barry. وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ from the signs of God, وَاخْتِلَافُ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ وَأَلْوَانِكُمْ, the different tongues that we speak, the different languages, the different dialects, the different colors that you see of humans. One person is white, one person is black, one person is Asian, one person is tall, one person is short. So these are different signs of God's creation. Like you have all these different plants, different animals, but we can't say, okay, if you want to be this, you have to be this. You cannot encompass something that God has himself created to live freely. You can't put it in a bottle, so to speak.
But it is something that challenges patriarchy, which is the dominant, ideology around the world in many countries, not only in the Islamic world, but also in many other parts of the world too.
Yes. And that's why there is this violent reaction. Historically, it has existed. And I remember I was asked, why is it, even though, and we went through these training workshops where we went through the stories of Sodom and Gomorrah, and with some people that wanted to understand the text. So we went through them. They said, oh wow, we can't believe it's not even there, the term. I said, well, why do you think the response is so... and people will give you different ways of how they think. But the one thing I found was that it is a threat to patriarchy, the masculinity. What is, my father, for example, would say, men don't go in the kitchen, it's a woman's role. A friend of mine said, when his wife wanted to get a job, he said, oh, but babe, who's going to cook the food? Who's going to look after the kids? So there's this gender and roles that we inherit somehow, pick up along the way, and we repeat it. It's repeated sometimes, even though my friend that I was talking about was born in Australia, never left the country.
But those roles, I suppose, are starting to break down in the West.
Yes.
In the Islamic world, they're still quite rigid, would you say?
They are. We are going, though, through that change. Change doesn't happen in a lifetime. But, there is... Like I said earlier, there is a shift, there is a change happening. Last night, I was speaking at an event at Sydney University, the first Sydney Queer Muslim symposium, and you should have seen, Barry, the number of people, academics, physicians, who said, look, one of the physicians was a general practitioner somewhere in Western Sydney, where it's predominantly Arab people there or Muslim people, but she said, even in a professional setting, we feel gagged, because we don't know how to address this. But there is a shift happening. People are coming out to find alternatives. I said, the fact that you're here, it's for shift to happen. Agents for change are needed, and it cannot be left to other people to do it.
As with the Bible, is it a case of needing to read the Quran in the text of the times in which it was written, in terms of any passages that could be conceived as being anti-LGBTIQ?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you're talking about a scripture that was revealed 6th century, 7th century, where, I mean, the Arabs that Muhammad came to were Arabs that used to bury their daughters alive out of shame. I have a daughter, I'm a father of a daughter. Imagine a man who there's a verse that says, وَإِذَا بُشِّرَ أَحَدُهُمْ بِالْأُنْثَى, when one of them is told the good news of a female child, ظَلَّ وَجْهُهُ مُسْوَدًّا وَهُوَ كَظِيمٌ, his face will turn out of, anger. And then his fellow friends will make fun of him. Oh, look, he's got a daughter. So it was such bury them. Take the child and go to the desert of Arabia, dig a hole and bury the child alive.
Out of shame.
Out of shame. Out of shame. And there's another verse, وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ, that day will come on the day of judgment when that child that was buried alive will ask God, what have I done to deserve this? It was such a society that he came to. For him to, within a period of 23 years, to have women allow them to have half inheritance of a man, I think to me, in 23-year period for such a society was in itself revolutionary. And to even have rights from being buried alive to having some sort of rights in leadership and so forth. Not imams, so they weren't accepted as imams, but it's that change. So it needs to be contextualized. The context of some of those verses, it was talking to that society, a society that, as I said, maniacal in their way of thinking, burying your daughter alive out of shame. And sadly, 1,339 years later, some Muslims and some other religious denominations do that in the name of religion. Not necessarily physically, like it used to happen back then, but they would bury their child, like what happens to the LGBT queer young people, being condemned simply because they are not following a particular, you're not Muslim if you don't do this, or you have to get married, or and that's a form of burial because the effects that it has, it's psychological, it's irreversible, like I mentioned. Sometimes it's permanent.
There are a lot of LGBTIQ people in the Islamic world who feel the pressure, I suppose, from society, from the family, to get married and live a secret life, I suppose.
Well, you're talking with one. I was married. I fathered a daughter. And my ex-wife, she loved me, and I loved her. And I was told, just get married, it will go away. Because at that time I was on young imam who thought I would, I was on the board of Imams of Victoria, the youngest back then. I like to describe myself then like a young bull, and I was fat back then, thinking I would change the world. But I was told, get married, don't act on it, it will go away. And I lasted 1 year and I never cheated on her, thank heavens. But I had a problem with that. I had a problem with other men. As a man who was an imam, I saw this happening on a large scale. I saw men that were married with children and would be leading double life. They would go to gay saunas as they're driving taxi, and they would go into gay apps, and they would go home to the wife who's looking after the children and lead that double life. So I had a problem with that. Other thing I had a problem with is people letting go of their spirituality because they said, I've been kicked out of the mosque or out of the church or out of the temple because I'm gay. Or I said, well, no. Who can dictate your soul to you? It's your soul. So I thought, okay, how can I facilitate something in between?
Are there any signs in Muslim majority countries of the growing acceptance of LGBTIQ people in 2018, do you think?
In Muslim countries, even if the acceptance is there, it wouldn't be publicized. But what I am fascinated about is not the acceptance of the hierarchy, because I think it was Antonio Gramsci, who said the tragedy, and it's very relevant to what's happening in the Muslim world. He said the tragedy lies precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the young cannot be born. And he calls the gap in between interregnum. He says in this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. So the mental health, the self-harm, the addiction within young people. Because the old school of thought, this mentality that's very Wahhabi oriented, is controlling. The Saudi government now coming across as if they are doing changes, but the leadership and specifically the imams, the power that they have is very tight on and young people who want to live freely, who a lot of Saudi young people have been educated in the West. They go to, and they have this freedom, but they go back and they have to submit but young people are finding ways, interestingly, finding ways to be artistic, to be innovative, and to reclaim their spiritual and sexual identities.
What hope do you see in the future for a more progressive and enlightened Islam accepting of LGBTIQ people?
We've started 4 years ago, last night in Sydney University. I mean, I'm not one who gets emotional, particularly in public, but last night, I mean, Sydney was a big thorn on my spiritual conscience. Because there is that leadership of the Islamic community here, and I couldn't. I mean, there was a mutual hatred for each other from me and them over the years, but I couldn't get through. And there were always young people reaching out from Sydney. So to have a symposium last night at Sydney University with over 100 people to attend was very emotional for me. So there is hope, there is change. So I'm very proud of what's happening in Sydney. Sydney Queer Muslims, they're called. Any Sydney organizations, including yourself, I would recommend that you connect with them. Because it is in collaboration that we can make change, make it quicker. And these are young people who, it was heartwarming to see that. So I'm very proud of what's happening in Sydney. I'm very proud of what's happening in some of Western Australia. It's still not ready yet, but there are people who are saying, okay, we will take this on. South Australia is next, so I'm going from state to state to state.
So there are support groups here in Australia for people who've grown up in the Muslim faith, to help each other who are LGBTIQ.
Yes.
And you're seeing progress there, and is there any opposition from the more conservative Islamic leadership in Australia?
I think by me coming out, it was a big shock for many of the imams. I am trained, as many as the other imams are. I've memorized the Quran, alhamdulillah. So I think one of the reasons I haven't had any backlash from the leadership in particular is because they know I'm not one who will be easily intimidated, and I will rebut whatever they come up with. So I think that has been a privilege, and I'm not trying to knock on wood, as they say. The same, I said to the guys in Sydney here, no, don't be frightened, don't let them frighten you. And if they come and say whatever, theological arguments to put doubts in your mind, I said I will counter that. Though I would reach out and say, there is patriarchy and there's what I call gaytriarchy. So there are well-established organizations, like I said, I had experienced in Melbourne, established organizations who have gone through the same issues that I'm talking about and Muslims are going through 30 years ago, 40 years ago. However, it seems that we forget. The word for human in Arabic is insan. Insan is derived from the word nisyan, forgetful. And generally, when we get in a comfortable position, we forget, So there is still a need, and I think established LGBT organizations globally should look for coming, groups that are starting up. And if you look, you will find people reaching out.
Are there movements in other countries around the world to establish LGBTIQ-friendly mosques, and how successful have they been?
So I know Imam Lutvich, for example, who started the first LGBT-friendly mosque in France, Paris. Muhsin Hendricks, last night he was on the panel with us via Skype. Muhsin is a man, I would suggest he is one of the first LGBT gay imams, 20-year activism. And he started Al-Fitra. Initially it was called I forgot the name, but now it's called Al-Fitra organization. But and he has his own congregation where they conduct prayers. There's facilities for mosques and so forth. There is the one in Germany. There is the inclusive mosque in England, London. So there are places, and they have been very, very successful. Very successful. So Australia, we are next.
Good. Finally, if anyone listening to this program would like to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
So my website, imamnur.com, imamnur.com, and also anybody in Sydney, they can Google Sydney Queer Muslims. I think sydneyqueermuslims.com.au, but if you Google Sydney Queer Muslims, it should come up. But personally, my website is the best way to contact me.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Imam Nur, for your interview today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.